All right, our next speaker is Greg Kleinheinz. Greg is the Viceman Chair of Sustainable Technology and a Professor of Environmental Engineering Technology at UW Oshkosh. In his laboratory, the Environmental Research and Innovation Center, ERIC, at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, serves as a research and testing center for environmental health professionals, industries looking to evaluate materials for biogas and conducting a variety of customized research projects. Greg's also been heavily involved with our work here in Door County, trying to keep our beaches clean and safe for tourists and visitors. And with that, Greg, I'll turn it over to you. Try not to get too mixed up here.
If I don't trip and fall over, it'll be a good thing. I'm good? All right, well, thank you to UW Extension and Crossroads, and this is Wednesday night at the lab, and for me, this is really the lab. So this facility is the lab that we operate in Door County for the routine beach monitoring, and so it's appropriate for us, even though it's Monday night, it is the lab. And in fact, today what I want to talk to you a little bit about is Door County and put the work that's been done here in perspective, and you may hear me a few times today say that, you know, when you live here and you work here and you're used to the things that go on here, we really take those things for granted, but it's not really the way that it is everywhere else. So what are the things that we're concerned with? What do we do about contamination? And then what are the benefits of healthy beaches? And I think lots of times people think about beaches in terms of the environmental side of things, or in some cases the public health side of things, but there's really an economic and a social importance to those beaches as well. So hopefully today we'll talk a little bit about those. And I always tell my students at the end of class, you're not going to listen to most of the things I tell you, but there's a couple take-home messages. So by the time you all leave today, I hope that one or two little tidbits of the things that I've talked about maybe make you look at the 30 or 40 odd beaches in the county a little bit differently. And so one of the things I can't say enough about is the partnerships. And this really, when I have the UW Oshkosh logo in here, I'd love to say I did all the work. I happen to be the mouthpiece right now, but it's really been a collaborative effort. A couple county agencies, in particular the Health Department and Soil and Water Conservation Department, and several others here, and certainly our students. And so we have 4 of them that work here this summer, present today. I didn't bribe them to come listen to me talk. But there's been over 100 of them working on various projects in the county, and I think from their perspective, and certainly my perspective, it's been a rewarding experience for all of them. And of course, when you put these up, it's sort of like thanking somebody when you win an award and you forget to thank your mother, or there's invariably somebody you forget. And on this slide, I actually realized I forgot one group that's really been a big sponsor for the county, and that's Wisconsin Coastal Management Program. And so if they're listening, don't hold it against the county. So to put things in perspective, there are 882 beaches on the Great Lakes. That's pretty significant. Now, it depends on what you consider a beach. So in Wisconsin, we have 117 beaches. There's actually many more of them if you consider the definition of a beach anywhere that there's public access. This is the DNR's definition of a beach, and so this is what we consider from a regulatory standpoint or from a municipal standpoint. And so with that, in 2012, nationwide, out of all the different beaches, over 1,500 had at least one advisory, and 5,700 had some sort of notification issued. Most of those are 1 or 2 days, and I think people that are familiar with beaches see the red close sign or the yellow advisory sign go up, and we'll talk more about that. And then it just disappears. And that's sometimes concerning, you know, what's wrong, that's not normal. In fact, that's very normal. It's a little frustrating if you're the beach manager or live in those municipalities, but that is very normal. Some beaches in Wisconsin, for example, there are beaches that are closed more than 40% of the beach days. So imagine that over the summer, more than 40% of the time those beaches are closed. To put Door County in perspective for everyone, here's the county. These are the beaches that have been identified by the DNR. There's over 52 of them. 27 of the Great Lakes beaches are monitored through the Beach Act and Health Department in our program. Most are high priority, so there's more high priority beaches, which means they get monitored more often than anywhere else in the state. In Door County, there's 3 inland lakes, and this is a take-home message. Only 4% of all the samples result in any sort of advisory, and less than 1% of those samples result in the beach being closed. So it's a very, very small amount. And so even though we have things that we'd like to improve upon in the county, and in my opinion, any closure or any advisory is too many, it's still, the county does remarkably well in being proactive, and we'll sort of talk more about that as we go on. But it's really part of our culture. So I'm a Wisconsin native. I grew up here. I I kind of went to the dark side for a little bit and went to Michigan and then came back. But that's all right. I'm here. And so I remember as a kid, going to the beaches in my hometown. I remember traveling to Door County, northern Wisconsin. We have counties here that have 1,700 lakes within their borders. So that's Vilas County. And then we have counties like Door that are literally peninsulas that are surrounded by Great Lakes that people just can't get enough of. Here's some historical. These are from the Door County Historical Society. Doesn't look like the swimsuits we see today. But the one in the upper left is actually the Alpine Resort, and you'll see that a little bit later as we go through this. But really, this is an important part of the culture and our heritage in Wisconsin, and I think sometimes that gets lost. But I think anybody that grew up in the state, I probably am going out on a limb, that can remember at some point they visited a beach or recreational water body in some cases. I, in fact, went to a meeting and I was going to the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association. It was in the Bahamas. That was terrible. And somebody said, I've been to Wisconsin, and your beaches look very similar to ours. I'd never been to the Great Lakes, but they're like inland oceans, and that's really amazing. And I started thinking about it, and I started looking at pictures. I'm like, yeah, this looks pretty similar. There's Caribbean beaches, and there's some Lake Michigan beaches, and they do have some contrast or some similarities. And then this is in January, and this is us in January. So I said, they're a little different. You need to come back in January. And they said, no, that's too cold. And she was wearing a sweater, and it was 78 degrees. So I guess the point is, we do take a lot of this for granted. I mean, these are inland seas. When we talk about water issues and water wars, if you hear about it, it's really going to be the gold of the next century. And we have so much of it here. We take much of that for granted, even though we do have a small window in which we can use it, right? So unless you're ice fishing, or like we're in Oshkosh now, they do sturgeon spearing. Anybody seen that? That's an amazing event. So there's a lot of ways people in the state have realized how they can utilize those resources. So what are we concerned with at the beach? The first one we hear about, the thing that makes most of the news, is E. coli. So that's the indicator organism that we're going to talk about. And so I want to start with a little bit of microbiology. And so bear with me for many of you that may have heard this either from me or other people that have given talks here or other places around the county, because there's many that have. But E. coli is this organism that's found in all warm-blooded animals. It's a transient member of the sort of microbial ecology around us, and so it isn't anything new or unusual. It's been there. It's sort of like the chicken and the egg. What came first, E. coli or the first warm-blooded animal? I don't know. But the primary host of this is that warm-blooded animal. There's a secondary environment. That's the beach in this case, or it could be a number of things. But we're going to talk about it with respect to beach water. And so once that mammalian host releases that E. coli, it comes out into the environment. Sometimes you can uptake that E. coli. It's not very pleasant to think about, but many of the diseases we're concerned with are transmitted via the oral fecal route. So we're eating other people's feces. Not a very pleasant thought, but it is what happens. And so when those E. coli are jettisoned into the environment, there's like this battle for survival, I'll call it. And there's less nutrients. It's not a very hospitable environment, and there's a lot of UV killing and desiccation of organisms. There's variable temperature and pH. I mean, it's sort of the reason that we evolved at one point to have microorganisms in our guts. We're a very stable environment, so they have to deal with pH changes and changes in temperature. And then there's predation. There are other microorganisms that prey on bacteria and smaller microorganisms, and that leads to death. So the E. coli's survival in the environment is finite. So depending on all these other factors, it may survive for literally minutes, and it may survive for days, or in some cases maybe weeks or longer. And there's much debate about how long and in what conditions and what leads to those survival characteristics, and that's really important as we talk about the beaches. But again, the take-home message here is E. coli is an indicator organism. And why do we use an indicator? Why don't we just measure the pathogens directly? Because we have millions of organisms per gram of your fecal material that are jettisoned into the environment, and so some are harmless. Some can cause harm, some can be pathogens, but the pathogens in general terms are much more difficult to culture. They're more fragile, they're more delicate. So we look for these harmless organisms, and we use them to indicate the presence of the more harmful or pathogenic organisms that would be present with it. And so we have a number of techniques that have been around since, in fact, the early 1900s, about 1919, when these first methods for E. coli and its relatives were developed. And so when we look at the levels of these E. coli, we're dealing with the risk. And so what is risk? It's really just a statistical probability that some event is going to occur. And so if the E. coli levels are high and you go to the beach, does that mean you're going to get sick? Probably not. But does it mean your risk is higher? It's sort of like crossing the road. And if the traffic's going 20 miles an hour, you have a much better chance of getting across the highway than if the traffic's going 100 miles an hour. And so it's the same with E. coli. The higher that number, your risk of contracting some disease-causing organism associated with that fecal material that the E. coli came from is much higher. And so we call it a statistical probability, but there are no certainties. And then there's individual immunological considerations to take into account, but there is a probability that it's going to make you risk or make you sick. And so when we talk about swim at your own risk, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions in here. That's maybe later for you. But I mean, what do people usually think about swim at your own risk? That there's no lifeguard present, right? It doesn't mean swim at your own risk. You're swimming in a cesspool or a septic tank. And so we need to put this in perspective again. Swim at your own risk really is you're taking that statistical probability of something happening to you when you visit that beach or that situation, and we use E. coli to help us. It's not the best indicator, and those of us that do this work understand that there's many, many limitations. But when that number increases, that risk that we're assuming by going to the beach is higher. Again, is it imperfect? Absolutely. Does anybody come up with a better one? Not a chance. People have been, since 1976 when the E. coli standards came out by EPA, people have been talking about there's human markers, bovine, cattle. We did a project in Sturgeon Bay where we looked at the molecular origin of all the animal feces in the storm drains. And we could find somebody's, raccoon. Well, maybe they don't have that as a pet. Cat, dog. We had a bunch of them. We had a guinea pig. We think it was a guinea pig, some strange DNA. But at the end of the day, these are all different groups of organisms that are sort of transient and passing through the population. Is E. coli a pathogen? Another misnomer. There's over 2,000 different species or strains of E. coli, and there's very, very few. You can have them on a couple hands, the number that are truly pathogenic. Of course, everyone thinks about O157H7, and that's the one we think about with raw hamburger and other things. And can that be found at a beach? It can be. Is it exceedingly rare? Absolutely. So again, E. coli is rarely pathogenic. It can be, but it is that indicator organism. So then that begs the question, what are the organisms that we're concerned with? And sort of this is my mini bug parade from, sort of like the intro bacteriology course or micro course. So salmonella, I think everybody's heard of that. And so that can be transmitted by avian species. And one of the things we're concerned with when we talk about waterfowl and other things at the beach. Campylobacter, so another one of those that's transmitted. And in fact, you'll see seagulls sometimes with a digestive problem, and you'll see little stains along the beach, and you can probably guess that they have a Campylobacter infection. Avian botulism is a new one. So botulinum toxin is an extremely potent toxin, and in certain conditions, we don't see it as much today, but if everyone remembers maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, I'm getting old, so maybe even more, but when the cladophora was really bad, those things would wash up on the shore, and what it does is it starts to degrade anaerobically, which provides an environment for botulinum or Clostridium botulinum to grow and produce toxin. And so those things can move, and then all of a sudden you're left with the toxin in the water, which is extremely toxic. Vibrio vulnificus, it's one we don't run into here too much, but if you're in the south, it's a pretty substantial risk to swimmers, more of a newer emerging pathogen. Norovirus or any of the other viruses. Viruses are very difficult to enumerate in the environment, but some of the organisms that cause the most cases of gastrointestinal disease, very difficult to culture, very expensive or to detect, and so we don't really look for those, but those are the things that are present in very high numbers. Cryptosporidium, so Wisconsin's got a lot of claims to fame, biggest outbreak of waterborne disease in Milwaukee. Cryptosporidium was a cause of that, so it's a protozoan. Cyanobacteria, and this is sort of, there's many others, but these are the sort of big hitters. Cyanobacteria, some people call them blue-green algae, so if you're microbiologists, that's very insulting to them. You don't call bacteria algae, their lower form of life. But cyanobacteria, and we're concerned with harmful algal blooms, right? So the cyanobacterial toxins, again, Wisconsin was the first place to have a really confirmed death from that. And so that's another emerging contaminant in the environment. So how do we monitor for this? Just very briefly. We collect water samples, the standard in Wisconsin, and you'll see our standards are a little bit different, and they were developed for a number of reasons, and we can ask questions later. But we have a very proactive approach in this state, and we have a very different approach than many other states. But I think it works pretty well. So we collect samples at 12 inches at the middle of the beach, or if it's a real long beach, maybe in multiple places. They're put into a 100 ml water bottle, whether you do drinking water or surface water. All water is analyzed based on 100 ml. Sample volume, so we don't record it per mil. Does anybody really ingest a milliliter? No, you're really ingesting a cupful or so, and 100 mils is about a cup. And so we place it on ice, it's returned to the lab, we analyze them right away. Most of the traditional techniques are cultures, so bacteria are put on some sort of media that lets them grow, and then they're cultured the next day, or they're counted the next day. What's the problem? You've collected a beach sample on Monday, and on Tuesday I can tell you that the water was bad yesterday. And so there are some problems with that. There's actually a new method, and in Door County, again, we've been doing this for 4 years, that's called qPCR, quantitative polymerase chain reaction, and that test results available within 2 hours. And so we're using this as one of those sort of test sites. A lot of people do this in Milwaukee or Chicago. Now they're starting to use it more. But the problem is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the levels of fecal contamination here are very low. And the problems we have at our beach, while any problem is too many, they're very different than you find in Milwaukee and Chicago and other places. So these techniques that were developed in very urban environments need to be sort of adapted, and we need to understand them here. And so that's one of the things that we've worked at Crossroads here and with our county partners. And so that holds promise. And so why is that important? Even in Door County, if you look back, where any example of a waterborne outbreak where body contact is involved in the transmission of that disease, even if you collected the sample on Monday, and you got that high result on Tuesday, and you could advise people to get out of the water on Tuesday, you really have a 24-hour window or some number there that people are exposed to that really high risk and high disease probability. And then the beach is closed and they're not in the water. If you don't do those programs where you monitor for things, people could be in that water for weeks before illnesses are reported to the health department or local authorities, and then somebody does some investigation and tests. And this county was a great example where it would have been beneficial. There was actually an outbreak the year before the monitoring program started or the funding was available. And so it's really important. Sometimes when nothing happens, it seems boring, and why do people keep doing this? But that's why. When there's these unforeseen events, that's really important. So what are the advisory? Wisconsin is the only state in the country that has a two-tiered advisory system. The EPA standard is 235, and we say MPN, which is most probable number, or it could be colony forming units. There's a number of different values you might see per 100 mils of water. That's that yellow sign you see there. That means basically there's an elevated level of E. coli, and that translates to a risk that swimmers should be aware of, and you can make your own choice of whether you go into the water. The closed sign, if it goes over 1,000 MPN, then the closed sign is posted, and this is universal in all Great Lakes beaches in Wisconsin. In fact, many inland lakes, City of Madison, Vilas County, Oneida County, Winnebago County, Wapaka, many of them have adopted the same standard, so there's sort of a universal signage and standards across the state. And are there people, I've been to the beach, and the red sign's up, and somebody's like, that goes up every once in a while, it's no problem, I'm still here. Again, it's a risk. Everybody can make their own choice. But at least when you use the water and it says swim at your own risk, you're making an informed decision on whether you go into the water or not, and that's your choice. And so what are the sources of this? So we talked a little bit about it. So this is Whitefish Dunes, one of the more pristine and beautiful beaches. So it can be kids. Wisconsin's, again, great because we develop little swimmers. Where else can your kid go to the beach and not have to go use the restroom? It's great, but anyway, so kids dairy cattle or other sort of domesticated animals. I mean, those get a lot of the press for things in other places. Domestic animals, so there's nothing worse than watching somebody walk their dog down the beach and have them do their business. Waterfowl, so there's a picture here of ducks. It can be other things like, of course we think about geese and seagulls, right? Deer, other things. I've been told the only animal, and I've never had this confirmed for me, but the only warm-blooded animal that doesn't have E. coli in its gut is a beaver. And I'm not a beaver ecologist by any means, but beavers are very clean, and so when they release their material, it's always in the water, so it's difficult. And I've had trappers, and people, I mentioned this at a meeting one time, and people just, said, "Oh, really?" And I don't believe it. I think there must be, but then I had people sending me all sorts of packages in the mail, and I think I got 6 baby Ruths in Ziploc bags, but it was. Anyway, I still haven't had an actual sample, so if anybody has one and wants to send it to me, we'd be happy to analyze it, and I can put that one to bed. And then, of course, you have other human impacts. This is not, this actually exists. And so, there can be many of things that have happened because of human occupation that we really are unaware of. And in one case, on the shores of Lake Superior, there was an example of, there's this beach that would really have a high level of E. coli, and then it would disappear. And then about a month later, it'd go through the roof, and then it would disappear. And it turns out there was an old cabin on a little river, and, grandpa or dad or whoever had put in his own homemade septic system, and the kids inherited the property when the parent passed away, and they had no idea what was going on. And every time they would bring a group of people to the cabin, E. coli would go up. And then, anyway, so that got fixed, and so it just things like that just are artifacts of history. But having said that, if you look at identified sources in the Great Lakes, most of the sources, in this case in 2012, 40% of them are still unidentified. So many of them are still unknown, and even some of these other ones related to stormwater and wildlife are really due to sort of groups of causes. So it's not one thing. And the other thing is, I know a lot of people have this conception that it's the city of Marinette or Menominee or Chicago or Milwaukee. In almost every case, and we've published papers on this, you don't see any fecal material coming from the outside in. As bad as that is, us as stewards of local beaches, it's our fault. In one way or another. Most of the things originate locally. And if you think about the sheer volume of water, it makes a lot of sense. Even jettisoning 10 or 20 million gallons is really a very small amount from the city of Milwaukee to make it here. And again, have those E. coli survive all the way here. And you have to have a sense of humor. So we're number one in the number two business. I won't bore you with a lot of these, but anytime you deal with feces, you have to have a sense of humor. My favorite one, and I was trying to get a picture of this, but I was driving a state vehicle, and I was right behind it, and it said, stay back 200 feet, this truck is filled with campaign promises. Anyway, many of them, and so I'm sure if you're a septic hauler, you have to have the same sense of humor. So once we identify the E. coli, then what do we do with it? What can we do about it, I guess? And this is one of the things I think maybe in my career, I've been doing this now. I've been at Oshkosh about 16 years, and I came after working for a couple other years. And this is one of the most rewarding sort of projects and experiences. We developed this sort of stepwise approach, again, in this county with the help of coastal management and the county partners, where we would look at historical data, we would do some site assessments, we would do this, what's called a sanitary survey now, but at that time, nobody had any name for this. We would do some beach redesigns, and in the county, there's been about a dozen that have been redone. There's mitigation, so that design is implemented. And then really, we can talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about that blue investment. What do we get back out of that investment that we put in to the beach? And so the sanitary survey is now an EPA standard. It was developed in the Great Lakes. It was piloted in Wisconsin, and in large part, many of the principles that were adopted for that sanitary survey were developed in Door County. It took us 4, 5, or 6 years as all the partners that I mentioned earlier kind of put their heads together and came up with a way to solve these problems. And now they've come up with a tool that has now moved from the Great Lakes, so in California and Washington and wherever on the oceans, those coastal communities have now adopted these sanitary surveys as well. And in large part, that was originated in Door County. Here's a number of the different factors. I'm not going to go through all of these with you, but every, microbial, but then also physical chemical data. And at the end, we just want to accurately characterize the possible sources of contamination. And I'll just quickly go through an example because I think people don't understand all the work that went into this. Egg Harbor, I'm going to use as an example, and many of you may have seen this. It's probably one of the best examples of the success of these. And there's many others in the county that went through the same process. They just haven't been redone as long. And so Egg Harbor, this is what the beach used to look like. Very few people swam there. You had this big rock jetty that also had a physical hazard. And so eventually that jetty was sort of removed. That nobody seemed to know what the history of it was. We asked many people, and it disappeared. This is what the beach looked like. A lot of hard infrastructure, again, through the course of history that served no useful purpose at the time. Infiltration systems were installed, and so even though at the end you'll see it looks just like a beach, it's actually an engineered waste or stormwater treatment system. And so infiltration beds were designed. This is the old beach on the left and the new beach on the right once those infiltration trenches were filled in. Again, here's what it looks like in the ground. We have sand and gravel and this biofilter mix of soil, and it's not as, just as simple as dumping some sand in a hole. And this is what the beach looked like on the right, again, when we were done, and that's what it looked like on the left beforehand. And so one of the things that we found, and here's the dune grass plantings and an infiltration area where, and of course in Egg Harbor, there's a lot of topography there, and so the water gets a lot of velocity overland when it comes through there, and so that's what these big rocks are for, to keep it from washing out the sand as it comes down that hill. That all grew up, and so now we have dune grass, we have infiltration swales, the water hit that, there's some porous pavement, and this is what the beach looks like from this is our state airplane. No, I'm just kidding. We have seen a seaplane out there, but this is what the beach looks like now, and this is what it looks like from the parking lot. This is a cord walk, so how do we get to the beach? This is how we do it. We train people. There's picnic areas, again, throughout. Each beach is a little different because each community got a chance to offer input on what they wanted to do. But at the end of the day, this is what it's like. And it's almost too many people for me, but that's really packed, and that's really an important feature of this, and something I was certainly not aware of. As we looked at this from a public health protection and environmental improvement standpoint, we didn't really consider the aesthetic improvements. And so we understand, because of the Wisconsin's Beach Health website and because of the behavior of tourists and even local citizens, they will make informed decisions about where they take their families or where they go on vacation based on the conditions at this beach. And has anybody been to the Egg Harbor Beach in the summer now it is just, it's busy all the time. And I counted one day we're doing some other projects. We're going to do some more economic evaluations, but literally over 200 people there from about 11 a.m. to 4 or 5 o'clock when we left. And those aren't the same people. There's some might be, but they're different people that kind of come in and go, and they're there for a few hours, bring their family. And this picture is pretty typical of what you'd see on that beach daily. And there's been a lot of positive feedback from that. So, a bunch of different quotes about sparkling water and beautiful scenery. One of the top 10 vacation destination places. Anybody that lives here just thinks, oh yeah, duh, why doesn't everyone come to Door County? But it does get recognized outside of that. A person making a comment in this particular quote about the boardwalks or the cord walks. There's a reason for those. They're not just for people to get to the beach. In many cases, they're angled. And why do they do that? It's for geese deterrent. So geese will not go places that they don't have line of sight. And so those are put there to guide human behavior, but they're really there, again, for a deterrent of something that might deposit fecal material there. Josh, who's the former administrator there, I think everybody, and now if you look at the Egg Harbor Beach and you've got the rentals and all the other redevelopment that's gone on there, it's really an exciting place. And many of the other communities are finding the same thing with their redesigns. Again, this will just happen to be the first that jumped in and did it. And so, when times are difficult financially, people wonder, well, I don't know. We have to prioritize where we spend our money. And when you think about it, there's really, it's a really smart investment. And I'll share a few things with you, but the Brookings Institute did a study where they looked at what investment in the Great Lakes would pay off. And everybody talks about ROI, or return on investment. And they said investing $26 billion in the Great Lakes will result in over $80 billion in short-term and long-term economic benefits. And it reinvigorates the economy regionally. There's this direct benefit from recreation in Wisconsin. We have over 15,000 lakes. Minnesota's only the land of 10,000. And so it's important. It raises property values. And one thing that I'll mention a couple times now, it makes regions more attractive to business and workers. And one of the programs in the engineering technology program, they're really starved for those people in Northeast Wisconsin. It's the largest manufacturing area of the state. And a huge part of their business is where they locate, and in terms of can they find qualified workers, and can they recruit workers to come work in those communities. Because people now, when they have choices of where they're going to go and they're highly skilled, they will go to communities where they are more apt to raise a family and be really happy. And so these kind of conditions are really important for them, where maybe 50, 60 years ago that was not a prime consideration. Today they are telling me, CEOs from these companies are telling me that that is a major consideration for them. Is my company located in a town where these opportunities exist for my employees, because that helps me with both recruitment and retention. And so what are some of the other economic benefits? We improve water quality. Again, not only for healthier beaches, but it's not, I'm not a rocket scientist, but it doesn't take a lot for me to understand that this picture before the remediation of this beach and then the picture after is much different. And so what does that translate into dollars? And we hope to, again, use Door County as an example on doing some pilots on this work. But many other studies have looked at $45 to $60 some per person per day at the beach. That's how much they spend in the local community. So again, picking on a town A, if they go to the beach in that town, they're going to stop and buy gas, stop and get lunch, they're going to get in the souvenir shop, they're going to do something else in that town. And so if you think about Door County, for example, 150 visitors per day times 30 beaches times 90 beach days times $50 each, just rough numbers, that's about $20 million. And so what does that mean? It doesn't, I mean, that's a little bit. Wisconsin's tourism industry is an $18 billion industry. Those numbers just came out again. A significant part of that is related to water. Door County's tourism industry, I think it just came out 313 million. Somebody in here might know better than me. I don't have any idea what percentage of that is water related, but I know that if you go through coastal communities and you talk to any business owner, and they said, if I had 200 extra people coming through my business over the course of a week or whatever, that would be huge. And when their year-round populations are 200, 400, 100, those are huge numbers. And so the differences between businesses, you're on a very small margin, right? They're working for 4 months out of the year or some number, and so they've really got to do everything they can to maximize their revenue potential. And so having a family or 100 families choose community A over community B is really important to all of those businesses in those towns. Billions are related to water, and if you look at the history, I was going to look this up before I left, but I believe it's somewhere around, the tourism industry in Wisconsin was $12 to $13 billion a year in 2003, 2004. So roughly a decade, we've added basically 40%. What other industries in Wisconsin have grown by 40%? Okay. And so that's a really powerful number. It's a really big industry in the state. Some of this may be deer hunting, of course, but or Wisconsin Dells, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But what does it mean for the local community? It's a huge asset. And so again, the property values, recruitment of businesses, and increased visitors to all those places that we talked about before. And so aside from that, and here's again Egg Harbor when it's done. So big difference between that and that. And so one of the other things is what I would call social equity. And so it's part of our history. And so people are able to visit the beach regardless of any sort of socioeconomic status that they may have. We, in my opinion, need to maintain these resources for the larger citizenry of the state. And so this is a key part of our history that's really worth, aside from the economic and environmental benefits, worth preserving. Here's one of the Dells water parks. If to go to the Dells, I don't even know what a family of four would cost, but it's easily the minimum, even if you walked there, would be $100. Just to get 4 wristbands and use the outdoor water park. And interestingly, another thing is, in order to use those facilities, and I know there's many reasons for this, but in very simplistic terms, they go through a tremendous amount of regulatory compliance to make sure that anybody swims at those water parks is swimming in a safe environment. Has anybody been to a water park where everybody has to get out because they have an AFR? That's an accidental fecal release. And everybody's out of the pool. That happens at, I won't mention names, Beach ABC in Door County. Does somebody run out and say everybody out of the water? No. You don't even know, probably. It just floats by you. But there are no requirements for beaches. So anybody that goes to the beach goes there with sort of this understanding that they're swimming in an area, and I think in most cases, as I showed, it is very clean. But anybody can visit this beach and they can partake in the natural resources. And one of the things I hear many times, I've heard many stories from people from my age to younger to people much older than my parents, and they tell me that, I remember living on the lake, I remember living on the shoreline, and I just couldn't afford it anymore. All my neighbors came in from wherever they came in, and they built $1 million homes, and I can't afford it anymore. And so I had to sell it, or my parents had to sell it, and so they weren't able to afford the things that their families had for years and years. But I can still go to the beach. I go down to the local beach that's down the street, and I get to enjoy that the same as I did as a child. So some conclusions. They've taken this proactive approach. I think Door County was very insightful in that it understood the importance of the beaches to not only the economy, the culture, and the lives of not only the citizens of the county, but the visitors that come here and enjoy all the great things that we see in Door County. And really the things that you see here, whether it's the sanitary surveys, whether it's many of the other projects that have went on here, things that my group or other people in the county have done, it's really a national leader. And all those redesigns that have been done in Door County, there's nobody else that has done that many. This is by far the most. The process that we adopted here is now being used in Michigan, throughout the Great Lakes, other places all over Wisconsin, but it all started here. And that's really a thing I think to be proud of. There's a lot of great beach researchers in this area, Milwaukee, Racine, but a lot of great things have originated in Wisconsin, and a lot of those in Wisconsin and Door County that have now been passed on nationally, and people have kind of picked up on those. Our beaches are in great shape. So again, the sky's not falling. The water's in really good shape. Can it always be better? Absolutely. But I'd rather try and keep the beach open that 0.7% of the time than work on another beach that I won't mention south of here that might be closed a significantly more amount of time. And I think beaches are one of these things that provide us this unique example of how we can really balance, and we get benefits for both environmental, public health, social, and economic benefits all in one project. So we don't have to choose. Are we going to do the socially right thing? Are we going to do the environmentally right thing, or the economically right thing? In the case of beaches, you get all of those things if it's done right in a single project. So fabulous example of how you can get a win-win-win-win. I don't know how many things are listed, but a lot of wins. With that, I'll say thank you and take any questions that you might have.